Please, you have to listen to me. That boy is not safe here another night. Emily Dawson's voice cracked through the sterile silence of St. Gabriel Medical Center at 2:43 a.m. And for the first time in her 6 years as a trauma nurse, she felt the walls of protocol closing in on a child who was running out of time. Before we dive into this story, if you're watching from your city tonight, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Now let's begin. Emily had seen broken bones before. She had seen burns, seen car wreck victims, wheeled and screaming, seen the worst that a Montana winter could do to a human body. None of it had prepared her for the quiet. Ethan Brooks didn't scream. He didn't cry. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed with his knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door like he expected someone to walk through it and take him back to whatever place had put those marks on his arms. "Sweetheart," Emily said, keeping her voice low, the way she'd learned to when a child's nervous system had been trained to flinch at volume. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. I promise." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes gray and hollow for an 8-year-old tracked her hand as she reached for the chart at the foot of the bed. She'd already documented the bruising along his ribs, the fading marks on his wrists. That told her restraints had been used in the way he flinched every time a door opened down the hall. She'd seen the pattern before. She hated that she recognized it so fast. "Dr. Whitfield needs to see this," she murmured to herself, already moving toward the nurse's station chart in hand, hard hammering with something between hope and dread. She found him hunched over a computer screen, half asleep, coffee gone cold beside his keyboard. "Dr. Whitfield," her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Room 214, I need you to look at this kid's chart before shift change." He glanced up annoyed at first, then saw her face and straightened. "What is it?" "Signs of long-term physical abuse, restraint marks, malnourishment, the kind of bruising pattern that doesn't come from falling off a bike." Whitfield rubbed his eyes. "Foster placement." "Yes, Harold Kane." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Whitfield's face shifted, the exhaustion replaced by something more careful, more guarded. "Kane runs 3 group homes in this county, Emily. He sits on the hospital's charitable board. He funded the new pediatric wing 2 years ago." "I know who he is." "Then you know that if we go making accusations without hard evidence, this hospital could lose funding and you could lose your license for slander." "I'm not slandering him," Emily said, feeling her pulse rise into her throat. "I'm reporting what I see on a child's body." Whitfield exhaled slowly, glancing down the hallway as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Have you called Child Protective Services?" "Twice. Nobody's picked it up." "It's 3 a.m, doctor. The emergency line rolled to voicemail." "Then we wait for morning shift." Emily felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "He'll be gone by morning shift. Kane already called twice asking about discharge times. He wants Ethan out before the day nurses even clock in." "That's not evidence of guilt, Emily. That's a guardian checking on his kid. It's a guardian checking to see how much time he has left before someone with real authority looks at those bruises." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "I hear you, I do. But my hands are tied unless CPS opens a case or law enforcement gets involved. I can't hold a child against a legal guardian's wishes without cause that will stand up in court." "The bruises are the cause. The bruises are consistent with abuse, but they're also consistent with a dozen innocent explanations a good lawyer could invent in his sleep. And Kane has good lawyers, Emily. Very good ones." She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of every hour they were losing. "So we do nothing. We follow procedure. Procedure is going to get that boy killed." The words hung between them, sharper than she meant them, but she didn't take them back. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable behind his tired eyes. "I'll flag the chart. I'll note the findings. That's the most I can do tonight." Emily walked away before she said something that would end her career before dawn. "Messiah." She found herself standing outside room 214 watching Ethan through the narrow window in the door. He hadn't moved. He was still curled at the edge of the bed, watching the door the way a rabbit watches the tall grass for movement. She thought about her own nephew for a moment, a boy about the same age, safe at home with parents who adored him, and the unfairness of it struck her so hard she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. She thought about the system, the forms, the waiting lists, the overworked case managers with 60 files apiece. the exact machinery that was supposed to protect children like Ethan, and instead swallowed them whole in paperwork, while men like Harold Kane smiled for photographs at hospital fundraisers. She thought about what would happen if she did nothing, and she thought about Caleb. She hadn't spoken to Caleb Mercer in almost 2 years, not since he'd fixed her truck's transmission in his garage on the edge of town, and told her almost offhand about the nephew he'd lost to a system just like this one. She remembered the way his voice had gone flat and distant when he talked about it, the way his hands had stopped moving on the engine block, like even his body needed a moment to absorb the memory. She remembered him saying, "If you ever see a kid in that kind of trauma, and nobody with a badge will move fast enough, you call me, I mean it." She hadn't believed she'd ever need to take him up on it. Her hand was shaking as she pulled out her phone. Caleb Mercer was awake when the call came in, which surprised no one who knew him. He hadn't slept a full night in 11 years, not since the day a judge in another state had signed custody of his nephew Danny, back to the very man who'd put him in the hospital twice. He was sitting in the dim light of his garage office, a space heater humming in the corner, an unfinished carburetor rebuild spread across the workbench, when his phone buzzed against the metal surface with a number he hadn't seen in 2 years. "Emily." His voice was rough with disuse. "Caleb, I'm sorry. I know it's late." "It's fine. What's wrong?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told him everything before she said a word. "There's a boy here, 8 years old. His name is Ethan. He's got bruising that's been building for months, restraint marks on his wrists, and a foster guardian who has more political weight in this county than the mayor. I've done everything I know how to do, and the system is telling me to wait." Caleb felt something ignite low in his chest, an old and familiar fire that he'd spent a decade trying to keep banked. "What's the guardian's name?" "Harold Kane." Caleb's grip tightened around the phone. He knew the name. Everyone in Yellowstone County knew the name. Kane's face was on billboards for his foster care nonprofit. Kane had shaken the governor's hand at a ribbon cutting 18 months ago. Kane was on paper untouchable. "Emily, listen to me very carefully. Is that boy safe right now, this second?" "For now, but if they discharge him at shift change, he goes home with Kane, and I don't think he survives the week." Caleb closed his eyes. He saw Danny's face the way it had looked the last time he'd seen him, thin, hollow, terrified, being led out of a courtroom by the man who would put him back in the ground. 18 months later, the state ruling it an accidental fall down a staircase that Caleb never believed for one single day. "I'm coming," Caleb said. "Don't let anyone move that boy." "Caleb, what are you going to do? You can't just walk in and—" "I'm not walking in alone." He hung up before she could ask what that meant. Caleb sat for a long moment in the quiet of his garage phone in his hand, feeling the old weight of the vest hanging on the hook by the door, the one he hadn't worn in over a decade, the one with the hellsangels patch still stitched into the back red letters on a white faded but intact. He'd left the club 11 years ago, not because he'd stopped believing in what it once stood for, but because after Danny died, he couldn't look at another patch, another ride, another brother's face without seeing his nephew's small body in a coffin, too short for the grief that came with it. He'd walked away from all of it and rebuilt his life one wrench and one engine at a time, telling himself the anger was gone, that he'd made peace. He realized now he'd only been sleeping on it. He reached for the vest. His hands, steady as they'd been fixing transmissions for a decade, trembled as he pulled it on for the first time in 11 years. The leather was cold and stiff, but it settled onto his shoulders like it had never left. He picked up his phone and opened a group chat he hadn't touched since the day he left a chat still named absurdly Iron Brothers 406, full of men and women he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, some of whom he wasn't even sure still had the same number. He typed 4 words. He didn't add context. He didn't explain. He knew in the marrow of his bones that with the right people he wouldn't need brothers. Hospital. Now. His thumb hovered over send for exactly 1 second, long enough to remember every reason he'd walked away, and every reason none of that mattered anymore. He pressed send. Then he grabbed his keys, pulled on his jacket, and walked out into the freezing Montana night toward his bike parked under a tarp in the corner of the garage, untouched for over a year. He yanked the tarp away like it had personally wronged him. The first reply came in 90 seconds. "Big Sal. On my way. Don't wait for me. I'll catch up." Caleb hadn't heard from Sal Salvatore Reyes, a wall of a man who used to run security at the clubhouse, in 3 years. He didn't know Sal still lived in the state. The second reply came 30 seconds after that. Wanda Preacher Cole address, now. Wanda had left the club around the same time Caleb did, move 2 counties over to raise her granddaughter after her daughter's overdose. Caleb hadn't spoken to her since the funeral 3 years back. She hadn't asked a single question. She'd asked for an address. He sent the hospital's location and started his bike. The engine roared to life beneath him, shattering the silence of the empty street. And for a moment he sat there feeling the vibration under him like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. His phone kept buzzing in his pocket as he pulled onto the road, notification after notification, but he didn't look. He couldn't look and ride at the same time, and right now riding was the only thing that mattered. 20 minutes to the hospital. Every second felt like an hour. Back in room 214, Emily sat beside Ethan's bed, trying to keep her voice steady even as her hands shook in her lap. "Ethan, can you tell me anything about Harold?" she asked gently. "You don't have to, but if you want to, I'm listening." Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, then away toward the door again. "He says I fall a lot," Ethan whispered. "He tells the doctors I fall a lot." Emily's chest tightened. "Do you fall a lot?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, then so softly she almost missed it, "Only when he's mad." Emily had to look away for a moment, blinking hard, forcing her professional composure back into place before the boy could see how badly that sentence had shaken her. "You're safe right now," she said again, more for herself than for him. "I'm not leaving this room." "He's going to come get me," Ethan said, and for the first time his voice trembled with something that sounded less like fear and more like resignation, the terrible quiet acceptance of a child who has learned that adults cannot actually be trusted to protect him. "He always comes to get me." "Not tonight," Emily said, and she meant it with every cell in her body, even though she had no earthly idea how she was going to keep that promise. At 3:10 a.m., Harold Kane's name appeared on the nurse's station caller ID for the 3rd time that night. The charge nurse, a weary woman named Patricia, who had worked the graveyard shift for 11 years and had learned to read danger in the smallest details, picked up the phone with practiced calm. "St. Gabriel Medical Center, this is Patricia. This is Harold Kane." His voice was smooth, warm, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to sound trustworthy. "I'm calling to check on my foster son, Ethan Brooks. I understand he was brought in earlier tonight." "He's stable and resting, Mr. Kane." "Wonderful. I'll come by first thing in the morning to bring him home. Poor thing, he's prone to accidents. Always has been, ever since he came to me." Patricia felt something crawl up the back of her neck, an instinct she couldn't name, but had learned over 11 years never to ignore. "I'll make a note of that, Mr. Kane. I appreciate everything you all do. I've always said St. Gabriel is the finest hospital in the county. That's why I fund the pediatric wing, you know. Children matter to me deeply." "Of course, sir." He hung up without saying goodbye, and Patricia sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone, feeling a wrongness she couldn't articulate settle over her like a shadow. She walked to room 214 and found Emily sitting beside the boy, and something in Emily's face told her she wasn't the only one who felt it. "He called again," Patricia said quietly. Emily nodded. "I know. Emily, what's going on?" "You've never looked at a chart the way you looked at this one." Emily hesitated, then decided the time for hesitation had passed. "I think Harold Kane has been abusing this child for a long time, and I think if we let him walk out of here with Ethan in the morning, we're signing a death warrant." Patricia's face went pale. "That's a serious accusation." "I know, and I've got nothing but bruises and a scared 8-year-old to back it up, and a hospital administration that's more worried about liability than about him." Patricia was quiet for a moment, glancing back down the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. "What do you need?" "Time. I need time until CPS opens in the morning, and I need someone with enough leverage that Kane can't just walk in here and take him." "And do you have that?" Emily thought of the 4 words she imagined Caleb had sent, the ones she hadn't seen, but somehow already trusted with everything she had. "I think I might," she said. "I really think I might." By 3:30 a.m., 47 riders had responded to Caleb's message. By 3:45, that number had climbed past 90. Word moved through the old network the way it always had, not through mass texts or public posts, but through a chain of trust built over decades. One rider calling, another one garage, lighting up one small town's worth of engines, kicking to life in the freezing dark, All because a man none of them had heard from in years had typed 4 words that meant something none of them could explain to an outsider. Need brothers. Hospital. Now. In Billings, in Laurel and Columbus, in towns so small they didn't have a stoplight, men and women who hadn't ridden together in years pulled leather from closets, checked tire pressure with shaking hands in the cold, and rolled out into the dark without asking a single question about why. Wanda Preacher Cole was the first to arrive at the hospital, skidding her bike into the parking lot at 3:52 a.m., engine cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot. She dismounted, looked up at the glowing windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center, and felt 11 years of quiet, ordinary life fall away from her shoulders like a coat she'd never really wanted to wear. She pulled out her phone and texted Caleb. Wanda, first one here, where's the kid? Caleb, second floor, room 214, I'm 3 minutes out. Wanda, copy. I'll hold the front. She walked toward the entrance doors, and the 2 security guards on duty that night watched her approach with visible unease. A tall woman in leather gray hair pulled back tight, a Hell's Angels patch stitched clean across her back, walking with the kind of purpose that made men twice her size step aside. Ma'am, can I help you? One of the guards asked, hand drifting near his radio. I'm here to make sure a scared little boy doesn't get handed back to the man who's been hurting him, Wanda said, calm and even. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to stand still and make sure trouble doesn't walk through those doors either. The guard exchanged a glance with his partner, unsure of what protocol even covered a situation like this. I'm going to need you to wait here while I call my supervisor, he said. Take your time, Wanda said, and folded her arms, planting her boots on the concrete like roots. Caleb arrived 4 minutes later, his engine's roar announcing him before his headlight even swept across the parking lot. He killed the engine, swung off the bike, and found Wanda waiting exactly where she'd said she would be. You look like hell, she said by way of greeting. Feels about right, he answered. Sal's 20 minutes out, so's half of Laurel apparently. You started something, Caleb. I started something 11 years too late, he said quietly. And she didn't ask him to explain, because she'd been at Danny's funeral too, and she remembered exactly what he meant. They walked into the hospital together, and the guard who tried to stop Wanda took one look at the 2 of them and made a decision that would define the rest of his night. He picked up his radio and called for backup, not because he believed they were dangerous, but because he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. An instinct told him this was bigger than a 2-man post could handle. Inside, Emily heard the commotion before she saw them, the low murmur of voices, the sound of boots on tile, the particular hush that falls over a room when something unexpected walks into it. She stepped out of room 214 and saw Caleb Mercer walking down the hallway toward her vest on face set like granite, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in hours. Caleb. Where is he? In here. She led him to the door, then paused, hand on the handle. Caleb, I need to warn you. He's scared of everyone right now. Loud voices, sudden movement, anything that reminds him of Cain. It sets him off. Please go slow. Caleb nodded once, and something in his posture changed before he even opened the door. The tension in his shoulders easing his hands, unclenching his whole body, softening into something Emily hadn't expected from a man who looked like he'd walked out of a storm. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Ethan's eyes went wide with fear at the sight of him. A huge man, tattooed arms, leather vest, gray beard, and he scrambled backward against the headboard, his small body curling into itself. Caleb stopped immediately, hands raised, and lowered himself onto one knee just inside the doorway, making himself as small as a man his size could manage. Hey, buddy, he said, his voice gone, impossibly gentle, a voice Emily had never heard him use before. I'm not going to come any closer unless you say it's okay. My name's Caleb. I'm a friend of Emily's. Ethan stared at him, breathing hard, eyes darting between Caleb's face and the door behind him. You gonna take me somewhere? Ethan whispered. No, Caleb said. I'm here to make sure nobody takes you anywhere you don't want to go. That's the only reason I'm here. Ethan's small chin trembled. Everybody says that. Something cracked in Caleb's chest, an old wound tearing back open Danny's face, flashing behind his eyes for just a moment before he forced himself back into the present. I know, Caleb said quietly. I know grown-ups have said that to you before and then let you down. I can't undo that. But I can tell you this, there's about 90 people on their way here right now, and there's going to be more behind them, and every single one of them is coming Because I asked them to help protect a kid they've never even met. That's not nothing, buddy. That's not just words. Ethan looked past Caleb toward the window where the first hints of gray dawn were beginning to touch the parking lot below. Why would they do that? He asked. They don't even know me. Caleb thought about Danny for a long moment before he answered. Because a long time ago, I loved a little boy about your age and I wasn't fast enough to save him. Caleb said, his voice rough. And I promised myself if I ever got another chance, I wouldn't be slow again. The room went silent except for the beeping of the monitor beside Ethan's bed. What happened to him? Ethan whispered. The little boy you loved. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Emily thought he wouldn't answer. He didn't make it, Caleb said finally. But you are going to. I promise you that. Well, Mio. By 4:15 a.m., the parking lot outside St. Gabriel Medical Center had begun to fill with motorcycles arriving not in a chaotic swarm, but in an eerie, disciplined rhythm. Pairs and small groups rolling in. Every few minutes, engines cutting off almost in unison. Riders dismounting and taking up quiet positions was near the entrances without a single raised voice among them. Patricia, the charge nurse, stood at the window on the second floor watching the lot fill with leather and steel, and felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Dr. Whitfield, she said into her radio voice tight, you need to come see this. Whitfield arrived at the window a moment later, and his coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the tile as he counted at least 30 motorcycles already parked in careful rows, with more turning into the lot every minute. What in God's name is happening? He breathed. I think, Patricia said slowly. Emily called in a favor. Down in room 214, Caleb's phone buzzed against his hip. He glanced at the screen and something in his face shifted. Not fear, not surprise, but the grim satisfaction of a man watching a plan take shape exactly as he'd hoped it would. Big Sal, we're at 60 bikes and climbing, parking lots filling fast. What's the play? Caleb stepped just outside the door, keeping Ethan in his line of sight, through the narrow window and typed back with steady thumbs. Caleb, nobody goes inside unless invited. Nobody raises a voice. We're not here to scare anyone. We're here so nobody can quietly make this kid disappear before the truth comes out. Stand, watch, wait. Big Sal. Copy that, Wanda copy. Within seconds, the message had rippled through the growing crowd outside, and Emily, watching from the second floor window beside Patricia, saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Nearly 100 bikers, formidable and imposing, standing in near total silence in the pre-dawn cold arms, crossed eyes on the entrances, disciplined as soldiers, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply present. That's not a gang, Patricia whispered almost to herself. That's a wall. At 4:40 a.m., hospital security called their supervisor, who called the hospital's on-call administrator, a man named Robert Ainsley, who arrived 20 minutes later in an untucked shirt and a face drained of color. Having driven through a parking lot he could not begin to comprehend. He found Whitfield and Patricia in the second-floor break room, both staring out the window. Somebody explain to me right now why there are. He checked his phone where security had just texted him an updated count. 112 motorcycles in our parking lot at 5 in the morning. There's a child in room 214 showing signs of severe long-term abuse, Whitfield said, finding his voice at last. His foster guardian is Harold Kane. Ainsley's face went even paler. Harold Kane sits on our board, doctor. He's donated over $2 million to this facility. I'm aware. And you're telling me someone called in an entire motorcycle club because of unsubstantiated allegations against one of our largest donors? They're not unsubstantiated, Emily said, stepping into the room, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I documented every mark on that boy's body myself. Restraint bruising on both wrists, rib bruising consistent with repeated blunt trauma over several months. Malnutrition markers. I've seen this pattern before, Mr. Ainsley, and I am not willing to let political convenience decide whether that child lives or dies. Ainsley opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, glancing toward the window at the sea of leather and chrome filling the lot below. This is a liability nightmare, he muttered. With respect, Whitfield said quietly, surprising even himself. The liability nightmare is discharging that child into the custody of the man who did this to him and finding out in 6 months that we were the last people who could have stopped it. Ainsley stared at him for a long moment, then looked back out the window where the number of motorcycles had somehow grown even in the last 5 minutes. I need to call legal, he said finally and walked out of the room, phone already pressed to his ear. Just after 5 a.m., Emily's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Oh, no, this is Detective Marsh with County PD. Got word something unusual is happening at St. Gabriel. Need to know what I'm walking into before I show up." Emily's stomach dropped, and for the first time since she'd made the call to Caleb, a cold thread of fear wound through her chest, not for herself, but for the possibility that everything they'd built in the last 2 hours could collapse the moment law enforcement decided to see 100 bikers as a threat instead of a rescue. She stepped into the hallway and found Caleb near the elevator, watching the growing crowd below through the window, jaw tight with focus. "Caleb County PD is on their way. A Detective Marsh." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "That's fine," he said. "That's actually good. We need law enforcement to see this and see it clearly before Kane gets here and tries to spin it into something it's not. And if they see 100 bikers surrounding a hospital and decide that's the threat," Caleb turned to look at her fully, "then I'll walk out there myself unarmed hands where they can see them, and I'll tell them exactly why every single person in that lot showed up tonight. And if that's not enough, Emily, then nothing I do is going to be enough, and we're back to where we started, a scared little bum and a system that won't move fast enough to save him." Emily nodded slowly, steadying herself against the wall. "I just don't want this to blow up in a way that makes it worse for Ethan." "It won't," Caleb said, and there was something in the certainty of his voice that she desperately wanted to believe. Because for the first time since this whole nightmare started, Kane isn't the only one with power in this fight anymore. 7. Detective Marsh arrived at 5:20 a.m., stepping out of an unmarked sedan into a parking lot that made him stop dead in his tracks, one hand instinctively drifting toward his holster before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He counted roughly somewhere north of 120 motorcycles arranged in orderly rows, riders standing at ease beside them, not a single raised voice, not a single aggressive posture, just row after row of silent, watchful presence. A tall woman with gray hair pulled back tight approached him before he'd taken 3 steps. Hands visible, posture non-threatening. "Detective Marsh." "That's right. Wanda Cole, I'm not here to give you trouble. There's a man inside named Caleb Mercer who called us out here. He'll walk you through everything. There's a little boy up on the 2nd floor who's been abused for months by his foster guardian, and we're here to make sure he doesn't get quietly handed back before the truth comes out." Marsh studied her for a long moment, cataloging every detail. The disciplined arrangement of the bikes, the absence of any alcohol or aggression in the air, the sheer number of people who had clearly organized themselves in a matter of hours around a single purpose. "Who's the guardian?" he asked. "Harold Kane." Marsh's expression flickered just slightly, something crossing behind his eyes that Wanda couldn't quite name, but recognized instantly as significant. "Take me inside," he said. "Yitran." Upstairs, Caleb met Marsh at the elevator, and the two men sized each other up in the way that men who have both spent their lives around danger tend to do, quick, thorough, unspoken. "You're the one who called all this in?" Marsh asked, gesturing vaguely toward the window and the parking lot beyond it. "I am. You realize how this looks, 100-plus bikers surrounding a hospital at dawn." "I realize exactly how it looks," Caleb said evenly. "It looks like a lot of people who refuse to let a child get handed back to his abuser while the system drags its feet. That's exactly what it is." Marsh studied him for a moment. "Walk me through it. All of it." Caleb did the phone call from Emily, the bruising, the restraint marks, Kane's calls to the nurses' station pushing for early discharge, the hospital's hesitation to act without hard legal cause. Marsh listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with every detail. "I need to see this boy, he said finally, "and I need to see the documentation. Emily's got it, room 214. She's been with him most of the night." Marsh started toward the room, then paused, glancing back at Caleb. "Off the record," he said quietly, "I've had 2 open cases in the last 3 years connected to foster placements through Kane's organization. Both closed for lack of evidence. Both left me feeling like I'd missed something I couldn't prove." Caleb felt something settle in his chest, cold and certain. "You didn't miss it," he said. "You just didn't have enough people looking yet." At 6:02 a.m., as the sky over Billings began to turn from black to bruised violet, a black SUV pulled into the hospital's front circle, and a man in an expensive overcoat stepped out, flanked by a lawyer in an equally expensive suit. Harold Kane paused for exactly 3 seconds at the sight of the parking lot, long enough for something to flicker across his composed features, quickly smoothed away into practiced calm. He straightened his coat, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the entrance, as if the small army of bikers surrounding the building were nothing more than an inconvenient traffic pattern. He had no idea yet that the 4 words sent from a garage 6 hours earlier had already begun to unravel everything he'd spent a decade so carefully building. He was about to find out. He reached for the door, and inside, watching through the glass, Wanda Cole quietly stepped forward to block his path. Arms crossed, expression unreadable, the first of many walls he would have to get through before this morning was finished. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice calm, immovable. "I'm here for my son," Kane said, smiling, the smile that had opened every door in this county for 15 years. "Harold Kane, I believe you'll find I'm expected." Wanda didn't move. "Funny thing about that," she said quietly. "I don't think you are." Behind her through the glass doors, Caleb Mercer watched the exchange unfold, and for the first time in 11 years, he felt something other than grief settle into the empty space Danny had left behind. He felt purpose. And somewhere behind him in room 214, a frightened 8-year-old boy sat pressed against his pillows, watching the sunrise break gold and pink across a parking lot full of strangers who had come in the middle of the night for no reason, except that he needed them. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Brooks allowed himself to believe, just barely, that morning might actually be safe. Harold Kane's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did a small, calculating shift, the look of a man recalculating an equation that had suddenly gained an unexpected variable. "I don't think you understand who you're speaking to," he said, his voice still smooth, still warm, but with an edge underneath it, now thin as wire. "I'm on this hospital's board. I've raised millions of dollars for this facility. I would very much like to see my son." "He's not your son," Wanda said. "Not by blood. Not by anything that matters. I have legal guardianship papers that say otherwise." "Papers don't leave bruises," Wanda said. "Somebody's hands did that." Kane's lawyer, a thin man with rimless glasses, stepped forward smoothly, inserting himself into the space between them like a blade sliding into a sheath. "I don't know who you people are, but you are interfering with a legal guardian's rights, and I promise you by noon today every one of you will be facing a restraining order and possibly criminal trespass charges." "Funny," came a voice from behind Wanda, low and even. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Detective Marsh stepped through the door's badge already out, his eyes moving between Kane the lawyer and Wanda, with the flat, assessing calm of a man who had learned a long time ago never to let his face show what he was thinking. "Detective," Kane said, and something in his posture straightened, recalibrated, a man reaching instinctively for the register he used with law enforcement, the one that had worked for him for 15 years. "Thank God. Perhaps you can explain to me why there's a small army surrounding this hospital and why I'm being denied access to my own foster son." "Actually," Marsh said, "I was hoping you could explain something to me first." Kane blinked. "Excuse me. 2 foster children under your care have been hospitalized in the last 3 years with injuries flagged as suspicious by attending physicians. Both cases were closed for insufficient evidence. I pulled the files myself 20 minutes ago." Marsh's voice remained level, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it now, a current pulling tight. "Now there's a third, 8 years old, restraint marks, malnutrition. A nurse with 6 years of trauma experience who's willing to put her license on the line documenting it. So before we talk about you seeing your son, Mr. Kane, I think we need to talk about a pattern." The lawyer's expression flickered just barely a crack in the smooth veneer he'd walked in wearing. "Detective, my client has never been charged with anything." "I'm aware," Marsh said. "That's usually how patterns work before somebody finally puts them together." Kane's jaw tightened, and for one unguarded second, something raw and furious moved across his face before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "This is outrageous. I am a respected member of this community. I have given more to child welfare in this county than anyone in its history, and I am being treated like a criminal because a nurse with a grudge and a motorcycle gang decided to stage some kind of intervention." "Nobody staged anything," Emily said, stepping into the doorway behind Marsh, her voice steady despite the adrenaline visibly coursing through her. "I documented every injury on that boy's body with photographs and measurements time-stamped, following exact hospital protocol. If you want to call that a grudge, Mr. Kane, you are welcome to explain it to a judge." Kane's eyes cut to her, and for the first time Emily saw something behind them that made her skin crawl. Not anger, but calculation, the look of a predator recalculating distance to prey. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, so quietly that only she and Marsh were close enough to hear it. "You have no idea the kind of trouble you've just invited into your life." "Was that a threat?" Marsh asked, stepping slightly forward, positioning his body between Kane and Emily without seeming to move at all. "It was an observation," Kane said, smile returning smooth as oil over water. "I have friends in very high places, detective. Judges, city council members. I funded half this hospital's pediatric equipment personally. People like me don't get taken down by rumors and bruises that could have a dozen explanations." "Then you won't mind," Marsh said, "if I ask you a few questions down at the station, just to clear all this up." Something in Kane's face went very still. "Am I being detained?" "Not yet," Marsh said, "but I'd consider it a courtesy if you came voluntarily. Otherwise, I start wondering why a man with nothing to hide wouldn't want to clear his name as fast as possible." Kane looked at his lawyer, who leaned in and murmured something too low for anyone else to catch. Kane's face tightened, then smoothed again, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Fine," he said. "I'll come in, voluntarily, because I have nothing to fear from the truth." He looked past Marsh toward the elevator, toward the second floor where Ethan waited. "But I want it noted for the record that I am being harassed by a mob while trying to see to the welfare of a child I have cared for and provided for 2 years." "Noted," Marsh said flatly and gestured toward the door. "After you." As Kane turned to leave, his eyes swept once more across the lobby, across Wanda's unmoving figure, across the rows of leather-clad riders visible through the glass doors, and landed finally on Caleb, who had stepped out from where he'd been standing near the elevator, watching everything unfold with a stillness that belied the storm behind his eyes. Kane's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Recognition sparked, though neither man had ever met. "You," Kane said slowly, "you're the one who called them here." "I am. You don't even know this child." "No," Caleb said, "but I knew one like him once, and I was too slow to save him. I don't plan on making that mistake twice." Something flickered across Kane's face, not fear, not yet, but the first thin crack of uncertainty in a man who had spent 15 years believing himself untouchable. He said nothing more. He walked out through the doors, past 120 silent riders who parted for him like a tide pulling back from the shore, and got into the back of Marsh's sedan without another word. The moment the car pulled away, the tension in the lobby broke like a held breath finally released. Emily sagged against the wall, hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her scrubs to steady them. Wanda turned to her, expression softening for the first time since she'd arrived. "You did good, kid," Wanda said. "Held your ground when it counted." "I've never been so scared in my life," Emily admitted. "That's usually when it counts the most." Upstairs, Caleb found Ethan sitting up in bed, eyes fixed on the window, watching the black SUV pull out of the lot below. "Was that him?" Ethan asked, voice small. "Was that Harold?" "Yeah, buddy, that was him." "Is he coming back?" Caleb crouched down beside the bed, bringing himself level with the boy's eyes. "Not today. Not while I'm here. Not while any of the people outside are here." Ethan's small fingers twisted the edge of his blanket. "He always comes back." "Not this time," Caleb said, and something in his voice carried a certainty that even he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to promise. "There's a detective downstairs asking him questions right now. Real questions. The kind that don't go away easy." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, studying his face the way children do when they're trying to decide whether an adult is finally telling the truth. "You have tattoos," he said, finally apropos of nothing, the abrupt subject change of an 8-year-old whose mind had reached its limit for heavy things. Caleb almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere in his chest before it could fully form. "I do." "Do they hurt?" "A little? Not as much as you'd think." Ethan considered this. "Emily said you have brothers outside, a lot of them." "That's right." "Are they going to leave?" "Not until we know you're safe, however long that takes." Ethan was quiet for a moment, and then so softly Caleb almost missed it. "Nobody's ever stayed that long before." The words hit Caleb like a fist to the sternum, and he had to look away for a second, blinking hard, before he trusted himself to speak again. "Well," he said finally, voice rough, "get used to it." So, downstairs in an interview room at County PD 20 minutes later, Detective Marsh sat across from Harold Kane, a manila folder unopened on the table between them, his lawyer seated stiffly beside him. Let's start simple, Marsh said. How long has Ethan Brooks been in your care? Just under 2 years, Kane said smoothly. I took him in after his biological mother lost custody. Substance abuse issues. He'd already been through 2 other placements before he came to me, both of which fell through due to behavioral problems. Behavioral problems, Marsh repeated. He was a difficult child when he arrived, prone to accidents, clumsy. I did everything in my power to give him stability. The nurse who examined him tonight documented bruising consistent with restraint, not accidents, marks on both wrists, bruising along the ribs consistent with repeated blunt trauma over an extended period. Signs of malnutrition. Marsh slid a photograph across the table one Emily had taken and forwarded to him with Ethan's medical file. Explain that to me. Kane glanced at the photograph with practiced detachment. Children bruise easily. He's always been sensitive to bruising. I've told his doctors that repeatedly. He's 8, Mr. Kane, not 70. Bruising like this doesn't happen from being sensitive. I'm not a medical professional detective. I couldn't tell you the mechanics of it. All I know is I've cared for that boy as though he were my own flesh and blood. Marsh leaned back slightly, studying him. You mentioned 2 other placements fell through before he came to you. I pulled those files too. Both foster families reported similar concerns, a child who arrived timid, then grew increasingly withdrawn and fearful the longer he stayed with you. One of them specifically noted, quote, the child appears to flinch at raised voices and sudden movement consistent with trauma exposure. Foster families gossip, detective. It's a small, insular world. People repeat rumors to justify their own failures. There's also the matter of Danielle Ruiz. For the first time, something in Kane's face went completely still. I don't know that name, he said too quickly. No? Marsh opened the folder, now sliding out a second photograph, a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, smiling in a school photo. Foster child under your care 6 years ago. Died from what the county coroner ruled an accidental fall down a staircase in your home. No witnesses, no security footage, because you told investigators at the time that your cameras had malfunctioned that week. Kane's lawyer leaned in immediately. My client has never been charged in connection with that incident. It was thoroughly investigated and ruled accidental. I'm aware, Marsh said, eyes never leaving Kane's face. I'm also aware that the detective who closed that case retired 8 months later and moved out of state. I spoke with him an hour ago. He told me it was one of only 3 cases in his 30-year career that he never stopped thinking about. The room went very quiet. Kane's hands folded on the table had gone white-knuckled. Are you accusing me of something, detective? I'm asking questions, Marsh said. That's all I'm doing right now, but I want you to understand something clearly. There are currently 120 people standing outside that hospital who are not going anywhere until this is resolved. There's a nurse with photographic documentation. There's a little boy who is for the first time in 2 years in an environment where he might actually feel safe enough to tell someone the truth. And there's a coroner's report from 6 years ago that I intend to have re-examined by an independent forensic pathologist by the end of the week. Kane said nothing. So, Marsh continued, I'd strongly suggest you and your attorney start considering how this looks to a jury because right now, Mr. Kane, it's not looking good. Back at the hospital, word had begun to spread beyond the walls of St. Gabriel. A local news van pulled into the lot at 7:15 a.m., drawn by scanner chatter about an unusual gathering, and the reporter who stepped out, a young woman named Carla Diaz, who had covered exactly 0 motorcycle-related stories in her 3 years at the station, froze at the sight of 120 riders standing in orderly silence across the hospital's front lot. She approached Wanda cautiously, cameraman, trailing a few steps behind her, microphone extended like an offering. Excuse me, can I ask what's happening here this morning? Wanda considered her for a moment, then decided the truth was the only weapon that mattered right now. There's a little boy in there who's been hurt by the man who was supposed to protect him, Wanda said. We're here so nobody can quietly make that go away before the truth comes out. Carla's eyes widened, slightly professional instincts sparking beneath surprise. Can you give me a name? Who's the child? Who's the alleged abuser? That's not my story to tell, Wanda said. But I can tell you this, everyone you see in this lot showed up in the middle of the night because one of our own asked us to. Nobody was paid. Nobody was ordered. We came because a kid needed somebody standing between him and the person hurting him, and the system was moving too slow to do it. Carla turned to the camera, adjusting her stance instinctively, as instinct told her this was bigger than a scanner blip. This is Carla Diaz reporting live from St. Gabriel Medical Center, where what appears to be over 100 motorcycle riders have gathered this morning in what sources describe as a protective vigil for a child allegedly suffering abuse. We're working to confirm details, but what we're witnessing here is unlike anything this city has seen. Within the hour, the footage was picked up by 2 additional local affiliates. By 9 a.m., it had crossed into statewide coverage. By 10, a national morning show's social media account had shared a clip with the caption, "Bikers surround Montana hospital to protect abused child. What's really happening here?" Inside the hospital, Robert Ainsley watched the coverage on his phone with a mixture of horror and dawning realization that the narrative had already slipped entirely out of his control. "We need a statement," he told Whitfield, pacing the small administrative office. "Something careful, something that protects the hospital's liability while—" "Robert." Whitfield's voice cut through his spiraling calculation, flat and tired. "Stop thinking about liability for 5 seconds and think about the fact that there's a very real chance we almost sent that boy home to die this morning because we were more worried about a donor's feelings than a child's bruises." Ainsley stopped pacing. "I know," he said quietly, and for the first time all morning, something like shame crossed his face. "I know, Marcus. Kane's donations fund a third of our pediatric equipment. If he pulls funding because we protected a child from him, then let every news camera in this state film exactly why," Whitfield said. "Because right now, that story is 100 times more valuable to this hospital's reputation than his money ever was." By 11 a.m., the number of riders in the parking lot had swelled past 200 word, having spread not just through the club's network, but through relatives, friends, and strangers moved by the footage circulating online. A local diner 2 blocks away began sending over coffee and sandwiches, unprompted, the owner telling a reporter she'd fed bikers for 30 years and never seen anything like what these people were doing. Inside room 214, Emily sat with Ethan as a CPS caseworker, a woman named Renata Alvarez, who had finally arrived after the overnight emergency line failure was escalated straight to her supervisor, conducted a general careful interview, working with a child psychologist brought in specifically for cases involving suspected trauma. Ethan's answers came slowly, haltingly, punctuated by long silences, but they came. He described a locked closet used as punishment. He described being denied meals for days when he misbehaved. He described the sound of Kane's footsteps on the stairs, a sound that still made his whole body go rigid even now, safe in a hospital bed 200 miles psychologically, if not literally, from that house. "He told the last people not to believe me," Ethan whispered at one point, looking at Renata with the flat, exhausted honesty of a child who had given up expecting to be believed. "He said if I told anyone lies about him, bad things would happen." "What kind of bad things?" Renata asked gently. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the parking lot below, toward the impossible sight of 200 strangers standing guard. "He said nobody would ever come for me," Ethan said. "He said that's why I had to be good, because nobody else wanted me." Emily had to leave the room for a moment after that, standing in the hallway with her back against the wall, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes, breathing through the wave of fury and grief threatening to break her composure entirely. Caleb found her there a few minutes later. "You okay?" he asked. "He told him nobody would come," Emily said, voice cracking. "He convinced an 8-year-old that being unloved was a fact of nature, not something someone did to him." Caleb's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his beard. "Then I guess we're just going to have to prove him wrong about that, aren't we?" Emily looked up at him, and something in his quiet certainty steadied her more than any reassurance could have. "Caleb," she said, "what happens if this doesn't work? If Kane's lawyers find a way to spin this, if the evidence isn't enough, Then I stay," Caleb said simply. "However long it takes, as many people as it takes. That boy is not walking out of this hospital into anyone's custody, but people who are going to keep him safe. I don't care what it costs." At 1:40 p.m., Detective Marsh received a call that changed the entire shape of the investigation. It came from a woman named Grace Holloway, 41 years old, calling from 3 states away after seeing the news coverage circulating online. Her voice shook as she introduced herself as a former foster child who had lived under Harold Kane's care from ages 9 to 12 over 2 decades earlier. "I saw the story," she said. "I saw the picture of that little boy's face on the news, and I couldn't not call. I've spent 20 years trying to forget what happened in that house." Marsh sat forward immediately, recorder already running. "Miss Holloway, can you tell me what you experienced under Harold Kane's care?" What followed was 40 minutes of testimony that made even Marsh's 23 years of hardened investigative experience feel inadequate to the weight of what he was hearing, a pattern eerily identical to what Ethan had described, stretching back decades hidden behind Kane's carefully cultivated reputation as a pillar of the community. "Why didn't you ever report it?" Marsh asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I did," Grace said, voice breaking. "When I was 14, 2 years after I left his home. Nobody believed me. He had letters from teachers, from church leaders, from half the county vouching for his character. I was just some troubled foster kid with a history of, quoting, behavioral issues. The case went nowhere. I gave up trying after that." "Would you be willing to give a formal statement on the record?" There was a long pause on the line. "For that little boy on the news," Grace said finally, "I'll do whatever it takes." By the end of the day, Marsh had 2 more calls from former foster children under Kane's care, each account carrying disturbing similarities, each one a piece of a puzzle that had been scattered and buried for over a decade, waiting for someone to finally start putting it back together. As afternoon wore into evening, the story exploded far beyond Montana's borders. Cable news picked it up. A prominent child welfare advocacy organization released a statement praising the extraordinary community response, while calling for statewide review of foster care oversight failures. Kane's nonprofit's donor page, once a source of pride, was flooded with comments demanding investigation. Kane released after hours of questioning without formal charges, the evidence still circumstantial. The coroner's report, still pending re-examination, arrived home to find his own street lined with news vans and a scattering of riders parked quietly at the end of his driveway, way present but not blocking, watching but not threatening. He stood in his doorway for a long moment, staring at them, his composed mask finally visibly cracking under the weight of a morning that had unmade 15 years of carefully constructed reputation in under 12 hours. His lawyer called him inside before the cameras could catch his expression, but not before at least one photographer captured the image that would run on tomorrow's front page: Harold Kane alone in his doorway, no longer smiling, staring down a street full of strangers who now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. Back at St. Gabriel, as the sun dipped low over the parking lot, still filled with riders, the numbers had thinned slightly through the day as some returned to jobs and families, but a steady core of nearly 80 remained with fresh riders arriving in shifts to relieve them. Caleb sat beside Ethan's bed while Emily finished her paperwork nearby. "Caleb," Ethan's voice was drowsy, the exhaustion of an impossibly long day finally catching up with him. "Yeah, buddy. Are you going to leave when I fall asleep?" Caleb glanced toward the window toward the lot below, where Wanda and Big Sal stood near a small fire pit. Someone had set up coffee thermoses, passing hand to hand among the riders settling in for another long night. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's eyes were already drifting shut, his small body finally beginning to relax into the mattress instead of curling defensively away from the world. "Promise," he mumbled, already half asleep. Caleb reached out carefully, slowly, and rested his large tattooed hand gently on top of the boy's small one. "I promise," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere until you're safe, however long that takes." Ethan's breathing evened out in his sleep for the first time that day, and Caleb sat there in the dimming light, watching over him, thinking of Danny, thinking of every second he'd been too slow 11 years ago, and swearing to himself silently, fiercely, that this time he would not fail. Outside, the number of motorcycles in the lot had climbed past 230 word, still spreading, still drawing people from towns Caleb had never even heard of, all of them converging on this single unremarkable hospital in Billings, Montana, for the same simple, unshakable reason. A child needed someone to stand between him and the dark, and they had come. Morning broke over Billings with a strange kind of hush, the sound of 200 idling engines finally cutting to silence as the sun cleared the ridgeline, and Detective Marsh stood at the edge of the parking lot with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hand, staring at a text message that had just landed on his phone at 6:14 a.m. Forensics lab preliminary re-examination of Danielle Ruiz's case complete. Findings attached. Recommend immediate follow-up. He opened the attachment right there in the lot, and what he read made his stomach turn over. The original coroner's report from 6 years earlier had noted a single fracture pattern consistent with a fall. The new pathologist, working from digitized x-rays that had somehow survived in an old archive box nobody had bothered to purge, had found something the original examiner missed or chosen not to see. Multiple healing fractures in various stages, some weeks old, some months old. Layered beneath the fatal injury like geological strata of violence nobody had ever accounted for. Jesus, Marsh muttered and immediately dialed his captain. You're not going to believe what forensics just sent me, he said the second the call connected. Try me, his captain answered, voice still thick with sleep. Danielle Ruiz didn't die from one fall, Captain. She died with a body full of old breaks nobody ever looked at because everybody trusted the man reporting the accident. We need a warrant for Kane's property today. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You understand what you're asking, his captain said slowly. This man has friends on the city council. Judge Ferris has taken his money for 2 campaigns running. I understand exactly what I'm asking, Marsh said. I'm asking for the truth. 200 people showed up outside a hospital last night because a kid was scared for his life, and the man he was scared of has a body count. Nobody bothered to investigate. Another pause longer this time. Give me probable cause that'll survive a judge's desk, his captain finally said. And Marsh moved fast. If Kane's lawyers get wind of this before we've got a warrant in hand, whatever's in that house won't be there when we arrive. Inside the hospital, Ethan woke to the pale gold light slanting through the window, and for one disoriented moment, panic seized his small chest before memory caught up the hospital Emily. Caleb, the sound of engines outside that had lulled him to something almost like peace. Sometime after midnight. Hey, buddy. Caleb's voice low and rough with the exhaustion of a man who had refused to leave the chair beside the bed all night. You're okay. You're safe. Ethan blinked at him, taking a moment to remember, and then something in his face shifted. Not fear this time, but a tentative, fragile kind of hope that looked almost more painful to watch than his fear had been. You stayed, he said. Told you I would. Ethan looked toward the window, and Caleb watched him process the sight of the parking lot below. Still full, still holding riders moving between small groups with coffee and quiet conversation. More bikes arriving even now as morning shift traded places with the ones who'd stood watch through the night. There's more of them, Ethan said, wonder cutting through the exhaustion in his small voice. There's a lot more, Caleb agreed. People kept coming all night. Why? Caleb had turned this question over in his own mind more times than he could count over the last 12 hours. And he still hadn't found an answer simple enough for an 8-year-old, so he gave him the truest one he had. Because sometimes buddy people just need to know that somebody's watching, that the bad stuff can't happen quiet anymore. That's all we're doing out there, making sure nothing happens quiet. Emily appeared in this doorway just then, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but something steadier underneath it, something that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. Ethan's sweetheart Renata's back. She wants to talk with you a bit more this morning if that's okay. And there's someone else who'd like to meet you if you're up for it. Ethan's small hand found Caleb's sleeve. Will you stay? Right here, Caleb said, not moving. The someone Emily had mentioned turned out to be Grace Holloway, the woman who had called Marsh the previous afternoon, who had driven through the night from 3 states away, the moment she'd hung up the phone, unable to simply give a statement over the line and go back to her ordinary life while a child endured what she once had. She stood in the doorway of room 214, 41 years old, composed and steady on the outside, though Emily could see her hands trembling faintly at her sides. Ethan, Emily said gently, this is Mr. Holloway. She wanted to meet you if that's all right. Ethan studied the stranger with the wary caution he applied to every new adult now. But something in Grace's face, a kind of recognition, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be explained, seemed to ease something in him incrementally. Hi, Ethan, Grace said, crouching down the way Caleb had, making herself smaller, less of a threat. I heard you've had a really hard couple of years. Ethan said nothing, but he didn't look away either. I did too, Grace said quietly. A long time ago, with the same man. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Harold, Grace nodded. When I was about your age, I lived with him for 3 years. Did he? Ethan's voice caught and he tried again. Did he lock you in the closet too? Something in Grace's composed exterior nearly broke at that question, but she held herself steady, nodding slowly. He did. And for a long time, I thought that meant something was wrong with me, that I deserved it somehow. It took me a lot of years to understand that wasn't true. Not even a little bit true. Nobody believed you, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Somehow, impossibly, this 8-year-old had already intuited the shape of a story that had taken Grace decades to fully accept herself. Not at first, Grace admitted, but I believe you, right now, completely. And there's a detective downstairs who's starting to believe both of us. And there's about 200 people in that parking lot who came because they believe every kid deserves somebody in their corner. That's more than I had, Ethan. You've already got more than I ever did. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing this, his small fingers still twisted tight into the edge of his blanket. Does it stop hurting? He asked finally, so quietly Emily had to lean in to catch it. Eventually, does it stop? Grace's eyes filled, but she kept her voice level. It gets different, she said. It gets so much better than you can imagine right now. I promise you that. By 9 a.m., Marsh had his warrant signed by a judge who perhaps, not coincidentally, had no campaign history with Harold Cain, and by 9:40, a caravan of unmarked and marked vehicles pulled up the long gravel drive to Cain's property, an imposing colonial setback from the road behind manicured hedges that had for 15 years projected exactly the image of respectable stability Cain had spent his entire adult life cultivating. Cain met them at the door himself, his lawyer already beside him, apparently having anticipated exactly this outcome, and stationed himself nearby overnight. This is harassment, the lawyer said immediately, snatching the warrant from Marsh's hand and scanning it with narrowed eyes. Based on what probable cause? Based on a forensic re-examination of a 6-year-old death that occurred in this house, Marsh said evenly, and 3 separate witness statements describing a consistent pattern of abuse spanning over 2 decades. Step aside, Mr. Cain. Cain's face had gone the color of old paper. You have no right. I have a judge's signature that says otherwise, Marsh said, and behind him a dozen officers began moving into the house with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this before, though none of them, Marsh suspected, had ever walked into a search quite like this one. What they found over the next 6 hours would end Harold Cain's carefully constructed life more thoroughly than anyone in that house that morning could have anticipated. In a locked filing cabinet in Cain's study, a cabinet his lawyer insisted repeatedly did not need to be opened right up until an officer produced a warrant clause covering exactly this contingency, investigators found decades of records. Foster placement files going back over 20 years. Correspondence with caseworkers. And buried among the mundane paperwork, something far darker, a series of handwritten notebooks, meticulous and clinical, documenting what Cain euphemistically referred to as corrective measures, applied to children in his care, complete with dates, durations, and Cain's own chilling assessments of each child's progress. The lead crime scene technician, a 20-year veteran named Dale Ferris, no relation to the judge, a fact he'd mentioned wearily to at least 6 people that week, stood in Cain's study holding one of the notebooks, his face pale. Marsh, he said, voice tight, you need to see this. Marsh crossed the room and took the notebook, flipping through pages of dates and initials, and felt something cold settle into his gut as he recognized among dozens of other sets of initials the letters E. He documented it. Marsh said, disbelief and fury warring in his voice. He kept records of hurting these kids like it was some kind of research project. There's more, Ferris said grimly, gesturing toward a locked closet at the end of the hallway. The same closet investigators would later confirm through Ethan's own description that had served as a place of punishment for at least 3 different children over the years. Inside, bolted to the wall at a child's height, was a simple hook and chain, the kind used for restraint, the metal worn smooth in places from what could only have been repeated use. Marsh had to step outside for a moment, standing in the cold morning air, breathing hard, thinking of Ethan's small voice describing footsteps on the stairs, thinking of Grace Holloway's trembling hands, thinking of Danielle Ruiz's school photo, and the multiple healing fractures nobody had bothered to notice for 6 long years. He walked back inside and found Cain sitting in his own living room, flanked by 2 officers, his composed mask finally completely gone, replaced by something hollow and calculating. Harold Cain, Marsh said, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the careful procedural tone of the previous day's interview. "You're under arrest for felony child abuse and pending further investigation, the murder of Danielle Ruiz." Kane's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but even he seemed to understand, watching the parade of evidence being carried out of the house in evidence bags, that there was nothing left to argue. "You don't understand," Kane said, and for the first time something like genuine panic cracked through his voice. "Everything I did to help these children. You don't understand what it takes to manage difficult behavior, to instill discipline in kids nobody else wanted." "Save it for your attorney," Marsh said, snapping the cuffs closed with more force than strictly necessary. "Better yet, save it for the jury. I hope they enjoy hearing you explain child abuse as discipline while looking at photos of an 8-year-old's bruised ribs." As officers led Kane out toward the waiting patrol car, he caught sight of something that made him stop mid-stride, a small crowd that had gathered at the edge of his property, drawn by the flashing lights in the caravan of police vehicles. Among them, unmistakable even at this distance, stood 3 riders in familiar leather vests, having driven out from the hospital the moment word spread that the search was underway. Kane's eyes locked with Big Sal's for just a moment, and whatever he saw in that gaze, steady, unblinking, utterly without mercy, seemed to finally completely break whatever remained of his composure. He looked away first, and officers had to guide him the rest of the way to the car, when his legs seemed to momentarily forget how to function. The news of Kane's arrest reached the hospital before Marsh's official phone call did, breaking first through Carla Diaz's live coverage, then rippling instantly through the crowd of riders still holding vigil in the parking lot. Wanda received the news via text from an officer she'd worked with years earlier, back when she still rode with the club full-time, and she made her way immediately to room 214, where Caleb sat exactly where he'd been for the last 18 hours, Ethan finally awake and picking listlessly at a hospital breakfast tray. "Caleb!" Wanda's voice carried something he hadn't heard from her in years, genuine, unguarded emotion. "They got him, arrested at his house 20 minutes ago. And Caleb, it's bad, real bad. They found records, a room. Marsh is saying they're reopening the Ruiz case as a homicide." Caleb's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, and for a moment he couldn't speak, the weight of 11 years crashing into this single moment of vindication that felt both enormous and somehow insufficient, because no arrest, no evidence, no conviction would ever bring Danny back. But it might save the boy sitting 3 feet away from him. "Ethan," Caleb said carefully once he'd found his voice again. "Buddy, I need to tell you something." Ethan looked up from his breakfast tray, instantly alert to the shift in Caleb's tone, the way children who have lived through instability always are. "Is it bad?" he asked, small, voice tight with the anticipation of disappointment. "No," Caleb said, and something eased in his chest as he said it, the truth of it settling in fully for the first time. "No, buddy, it's good. The police went to Harold's house this morning. They arrested him. He's not coming back for you. Not today. Not ever." Ethan stared at him, and for a long, suspended moment, his face didn't change at all. The flat, careful non-reaction of a child who had learned painfully that good news often preceded worse news, that hope was a dangerous thing to trust. "For real," he finally whispered. "For real," Caleb said. "He's in a jail cell right now, and there's a lot of evidence, buddy. A lot of people are working very hard to make sure he never gets near you or any other kid again." Something in Ethan's small face began slowly to crumble, not into fear this time, but into something rawer, something that looked almost too big for his small body to contain. And when the tears finally came, they came in a flood, deep, racking sobs that seemed to pull up years of buried terror all at once. Caleb didn't hesitate. He gathered the boy up carefully, mindful of his healing ribs, and held him while he cried, murmuring low, steady reassurances, and Emily, standing in the doorway, had to press a hand to her own mouth to keep from breaking down herself. "You're safe," Caleb said over and over into the boy's hair. "You're safe now. It's over. You're safe." Meh. But the story, as it turned out, was far from over. By early afternoon, as word of Kane's arrest spread through local and then national coverage, Marsh's phone had become nearly impossible to manage. Calls flooding in from former foster children across 3 states, some tearful, some furious, all of them carrying pieces of the same devastating pattern that Kane had built and hidden behind decades of charitable donations and community goodwill. A woman named Patricia Meeks, now 61, called to describe her own time under Kane's care in the early 2000s. A man named David Torres, 34, described injuries eerily similar to what had been documented on Ethan injuries that had gone unreported because as a teenager, he hadn't believed anyone would take his word over a respected community figures. By 4 p.m., Marsh's captain had assembled a task force specifically to handle what was rapidly becoming one of the largest institutional abuse investigations the county had ever seen, with detectives from 3 neighboring jurisdictions requesting access to Kane's records after realizing his consulting work with other foster agencies extended his reach far beyond a single county. This isn't just one bad man anymore, Marsh told his captain during an emergency briefing that afternoon. This is decades of a system that let him operate because nobody wanted to be the one to challenge a major donor's reputation. We need to know who else looked away. His captain, grim-faced, nodded slowly. Then we find out, all of it, no matter who it embarrasses. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted entirely from the tense, watchful vigil of the previous night into something that felt for the first time like the early edges of celebration. Cautious, careful but real. Riders who had stood guard through the freezing hours before dawn now gathered in loose clusters, sharing food someone had organized through a rapidly growing donation effort. Phones buzzing constantly with news updates and messages of support flooding in from across the country as the story continued to spread. Carla Diaz, still stationed outside for what was now becoming the story of her career, approached Caleb as he stepped outside briefly for fresh air, needing a moment away from the hospital's fluorescent lights after 18 sleepless hours. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "can I get a few words? People want to understand what happened here. What made you do this?" Caleb studied her for a long moment, weighing exhaustion against the strange, undeniable sense that this moment mattered beyond just Ethan, beyond just this hospital. "I lost someone I loved to a system that moved too slow," he said finally. "A little boy about Ethan's age. I promised myself if I ever got another chance to stop that from happening to someone else, I wouldn't hesitate. That's it. That's the whole story." A nurse made a call because she refused to stay quiet, and a bunch of people who understand what it means to protect family showed up because that's what family does. "Some people are calling what happened here a miracle," Carla said. 200 bikers arriving through the night, standing guard until a predator was finally arrested. What would you say to that? Caleb thought of Danny for a long moment, thought of 11 years of grief he'd carried alone in a garage, thought of the 4 words he'd typed with shaking hands less than 24 hours earlier. "I'd say it's not a miracle," he said finally. "A miracle is something that happens without anyone doing anything. This happened because a nurse refused to look away, and 100 strangers decided a scared kid mattered more than their own sleep. That's not magic, ma'am. That's just people finally deciding to show up for each other. I wish it happened like this every single time a kid needs it, without anybody having to call in a motorcycle club to make the system actually work the way it's supposed to." Carla lowered her microphone slightly, something in Caleb's answer clearly landing harder than she'd expected. "That's a hell of a thing to say on camera." "It's a hell of a thing that had to happen at all," Caleb said, and walked back inside before she could ask anything further. Usaga. That evening, as the sun began sinking behind the Montana ridgeline, Renata Alvarez returned to room 214 with news that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Emily and Caleb. Both the temporary emergency custody order the hospital had secured was set to expire within 72 hours, and with Kane now formally charged, Ethan would need a placement, ideally one that offered stability during what promised to be a long, grueling legal process. "The state's already searching for emergency foster placement," Renata explained, her tone carrying the weary caution of someone who had seen the system fail too many children to make promises lightly. "Given the media attention, we're being extra careful about vetting. I won't put him somewhere without thorough review, not after everything that's happened." "How long could that take?" Emily asked. "Days, possibly longer. We don't have unlimited emergency beds, and given his trauma history, we need a placement equipped to handle a child with this level of need." Ethan, listening from the bed despite the adult's attempt to keep the conversation low, spoke up in a small, tight voice. "Am I going somewhere else, away from here?" The room went quiet. Emily glanced at Caleb, then at Renata, uncertain how to answer honestly without frightening him further. "We're going to find you somewhere safe, sweetheart," Emily said carefully. "It might take a few days, but I promise you it will be somewhere good." "Will you be there?" Ethan asked, looking directly at Caleb, now his small face tight with a particular anxiety of a child who has learned that every transition in his life so far has led to something worse. Caleb hesitated, glancing at Renata, an idea forming that he hadn't fully considered until this exact moment. But that suddenly felt like the only answer that made any sense. Renata, he said slowly, what would it take for me to be considered as an emergency placement? Renata blinked, clearly not expecting this. Mr. Mercer, emergency foster certification is an extensive process. Background checks, home study training requirements. I'll do all of it, Caleb said. Today, right now, if you'll let me start. I've got a clean record, steady working home with enough room for a kid, and I will not let this boy get shuffled into a system that already failed him once. Renata studied him for a long moment, weighing procedure against the extraordinary circumstances of the last 24 hours, the outpouring of community support, and perhaps most persuasively, the way Ethan's entire body had visibly relaxed at the mere suggestion. I can't promise anything, she said finally, but I can expedite an emergency review given the unusual circumstances and the level of public attention on this case. It won't be simple and it won't be fast, but I'll make some calls tonight. Ethan's eyes wide and cautiously hopeful moved between Renata and Caleb. You'd really do that, he asked Caleb. For me, Caleb's throat tightened, and it took him a moment to trust his voice enough to answer. Buddy, he said finally, I already told you I wasn't going anywhere. I meant it. 2 hours later, as Renata worked the phones from the hospital's small conference room, calling in favors and expediting paperwork with an urgency her job rarely allowed, Marsh arrived at the hospital with an update that added an entirely new layer of complexity to the unfolding case. We found something else at the property, he told Caleb and Emily quietly in the hallway, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to Ethan's room. Financial records showing Kane received substantial funding from the county's foster care oversight office over the last decade, well beyond what his official placements would account for. We think he may have been falsifying placement numbers, claiming children in his care who either didn't exist or had already aged out, and pocketing the difference. So on top of everything else, he was defrauding the system too, Emily said, disgust evident in her voice. Looks that way, and there's more. County records show at least 2 prior complaints against Kane over the years that were closed without investigation, both by the same case supervisor. A woman named Diane Forsyth, still employed with the county, still overseeing foster placement reviews. Caleb's expression darkened. You're saying someone in the system knew and buried it. I'm saying it's looking that way, Marsh said grimly, which means this doesn't end with Kane. If someone was covering for him, actively bearing complaints, that's a separate criminal investigation, and it means the system that's supposed to protect kids like Ethan had a hole in it big enough for a predator to operate for over 2 decades. Emily felt her stomach twist. How many kids fell through that hole while it was open? That's what we're trying to find out, Marsh said. Every case Forsyth closed over the last 15 years is getting reopened for review starting tonight. As night fell again over St. Gabriel Medical Center, the number of riders in the parking lot had settled into a steady core of around 150, not the overwhelming force of the previous night, but a committed rotating presence that showed no sign of leaving until Ethan's placement was fully secured. Local businesses continued sending food. A small mountain of cards and drawings from children across the county, moved by news coverage of Ethan's story, had begun arriving at the hospital's front desk, each one carefully collected by staff to give to him when he was ready. Inside room 214, as Ethan finally drifted into a deeper, more peaceful sleep than he'd managed in longer than anyone could guess, Emily sat beside Caleb in the small visitors' chairs, both of them running on fumes after nearly 40 hours without real rest. Do you think it'll actually happen? Emily asked quietly. The placement. Caleb watched Ethan's chest rise and fall, steady and calm for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I don't know, he admitted. I've never done anything like this before. I don't know the first thing about raising a kid, about trauma therapy, about any of it. You knew exactly what to say to him last night when nobody else could reach him, Emily said. You held him together when Kane was arrested. I think you know more than you're giving yourself credit for. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the sleeping boy. Danny used to sleep like that, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. When things were good before everything fell apart. Just completely still, completely trusting that nothing was going to hurt him while he was asleep. He swallowed hard. I forgot what that looked like until just now. Emily reached over and squeezed his arm gently. No words necessary, and the two of them sat together in the quiet hum of hospital monitors watching over a sleeping child who, for reasons neither of them could have predicted 24 hours earlier, had somehow become the center of both their entire worlds. Outside, beneath a sky finally clearing of clouds, the riders kept their watch engines silent. Voices low, a strange and unlikely army, standing guard over a promise none of them had ever expected to make, but that every single one of them intended to keep for as long as it took. And somewhere across town in a county records office that would not open again until morning, a file cabinet sat quietly in the dark containing 15 years of Diane Forsyth's closed complaints, evidence of a wound in the system far larger than anyone at St. Gabriel Medical Center, yet understood, waiting for daylight to reveal exactly how deep it truly ran. Morning came again to Billings, and with it, Diane Forsyth walked into her office at the county Foster Care Oversight Division with no idea that her entire career was about to unravel in the space of a single business day. She was 58 years old, 22 years into a job she'd once believed in deeply, and as she set her coffee down on her desk and powered on her computer, she had no way of knowing that Detective Marsh's task force had already pulled every case file bearing her signature from the last 15 years, cross-referencing closed complaints against active abuse investigations with a thoroughness that would soon expose a pattern she'd spent years telling herself didn't exist. Her phone rang at 8:47 a.m. "Miss Forsyth, this is Detective Marsh with County PD. I need you to come down to the station this morning. We have some questions regarding several closed cases from your caseload." Diane's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "Which cases? I'd rather discuss that in person. Is this about Harold Kane?" There was a pause on the line just long enough to tell Marsh everything he needed to know. "Ms. Forsyth, I'll expect you within the hour," he said, and hung up before she could ask anything further. Diane sat frozen at her desk for a long moment, staring at the framed commendation on her wall. 15 years of dedicated service to Yellowstone County's children, and felt something cold and inevitable settle over her. The particular dread of a person who has spent years successfully avoiding a reckoning, finally watching it arrive at her door. By the time Diane arrived at the police station, Marsh had already spent 2 hours cross-referencing her closed complaints against the growing pile of testimony from former foster children under Kane's supervision, and the pattern staring back at him from his desk was damning in its simplicity. Every single complaint filed against Kane over the past 15 years, 4 in total spanning multiple counties and multiple caseworkers, had eventually crossed Diane's desk for final review. And every single one had been closed within days marked insufficient evidence in her careful practice handwriting. "Ms. Forsyth," Marsh said, sliding the first file across the table as she sat down, visibly shaken. Her lawyer hastily retained that morning, seated stiffly beside her. "This complaint was filed in 2019 by a foster mother who reported unexplained bruising on a child who had visited Kane's home for a supervised transition visit. You closed it in 4 days." "I reviewed it according to standard protocol," Diane said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Standard protocol usually involves at least one follow-up interview with the reporting party. There's no record of that happening here." "I don't remember every case in detail, Detective. I handle hundreds of files a year." "Then let's talk about this one." Marsh slid a second file across the table. 2016, a teacher reported a student a former placement of Kane's since aged out of the system, describing physical punishment and restraint. You closed this one in 2 days, noting the source as, quote, unreliable, given the student's history of behavioral issues. Diane's hands folded tightly on the table had begun to tremble. "And this one," Marsh continued, voice hardening, "is the file from 6 years ago. Danielle Ruiz, ruled an accidental death. You signed off on closing the file without requesting an independent forensic review, despite a note from the attending nurse at the time flagging, and I'm reading directly here, inconsistencies in reported injury pattern." The room went very quiet. "I want to know," Marsh said, leaning forward, "why every single complaint against Harold Kane for 15 years ended up on your desk, and why every single one of them disappeared within days." Diane's lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but she waved him off, something breaking open in her face that looked less like guilt and more disturbingly like relief. The exhaustion of a person who has carried a secret so long that even its discovery comes as a kind of release. "He funded my daughter's medical treatment," she said quietly. 6 years ago, She needed a surgery our insurance wouldn't cover. Harold paid for all of it, never asked for anything in return, not directly. But you understood what he expected, Marsh said. Diane's eyes filled and she nodded slowly. I told myself the complaints were unreliable. I told myself foster kids exaggerate, that they lie to get attention, that Harold had never once given me reason to distrust him personally. I told myself so many things, Detective, and somewhere along the way I actually started believing them. She looked up and something in her face had gone hollow. How many kids? What? How many kids did I fail while I was telling myself lies to protect my daughter's surgery? Marsh didn't have an answer for her, not one that would offer any comfort, so he simply let the silence sit there heavy and unforgiving until her lawyer finally spoke up to request a formal statement be taken with proper legal representation present. Back at St. Gabriel, Renata Alvarez arrived at room 214 just after 9 a.m., with news that made Emily's breath catch and Caleb rise halfway out of his chair before he'd even fully processed what she'd said. The emergency review board convened first thing this morning. Renata said, a rare smile breaking through her usually careful, guarded expression. Given the extraordinary circumstances, the public attention, and honestly, Mr. Mercer, given how thoroughly you passed every background check we could possibly run overnight, they've approved you for emergency foster placement. Provisional pending full certification over the coming months, but effective immediately. Ethan, who had been listening with the particular intensity children develop when they've learned that adult conversations often determine the entire shape of their lives, sat bolt upright in bed. I get to stay with Caleb, he asked, voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make the offer disappear. You get to go home with Caleb, Renata confirmed, as soon as we finish the discharge paperwork. There will be regular check-ins, ongoing therapy requirements given everything you've been through, and this placement will be reviewed formally in 30 days. But yes, sweetheart, for now you're going with Caleb. The sound Ethan made then wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a some entirely new combination of both a release valve for 18 months of accumulated terror, finally letting go. And Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered the boy into his arms, holding him as tightly as he dared, given his healing ribs, both of them shaking with an emotion too large for words. I told you, Caleb said roughly into the boy's hair. I told you I wasn't going anywhere. Emily had to turn away for a moment, wiping her own eyes, and found Wanda standing in the doorway, having apparently arrived just in time to witness the moment, her weathered face uncharacteristically soft. Well, Wanda said, voice thick. Guess we better go clean up that garage of his. Kid's gonna need a proper room, not a workbench and a pile of motorcycle parts. Word of the placement spread through the parking lot within minutes, and what happened next surprised even Caleb, who thought he'd already witnessed the full extent of what this community was capable of in the last 48 hours. By noon, an impromptu collection effort had begun among the riders. Cash pooled together, calls made to contacts in construction and home goods, a plan, taking shape with the same disciplined efficiency that had brought 200 people to a hospital parking lot in the middle of the night. Big Sal, it turned out, owned a small contracting business on the side, and by early afternoon he'd recruited 4 other riders with construction backgrounds to head to Caleb's property and begin converting the spare room above his garage, currently used for storage, into an actual bedroom, complete with fresh paint, new flooring and furniture purchased that same afternoon from a donation fund that had, by evening, collected over $11,000 from people across the country who had followed Ethan's story online. You don't have to do this, Caleb told Sal when he found out, standing in his own driveway watching lumber get him unloaded from a truck. I can handle fixing up a room myself. Course you can, Sal said, not looking up from the tape measure in his hands. But you're going to be busy the next few weeks, learning how to be somebody's dad. Let us handle the hammer and nails. Caleb didn't have a response to that. He simply stood there for a long moment, watching people he hadn't spoken to in over a decade rebuild not just a room, but something in himself he thought was permanently broken, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since the day Danny died. That evening, as Marsh continued unraveling the scope of Diane Forsyth's complicity, a scope that by end of day had expanded to include evidence she'd similarly buried complaints against at least 2 other foster placements over the years, none as severe as Kane's, but disturbing nonetheless, he received a call that added an entirely unexpected dimension to the case. The caller identified herself as Susan Kane Harold's estranged sister, calling from out of state after seeing the news coverage. I haven't spoken to Harold in almost a decade, she told Marsh, her voice tight with a complicated mixture of guilt and vindication. We had a falling out after I confronted him about our own childhood. Detective, our father he was not a good man. Harold learned things in that house that I've spent my whole life trying to forget, and I always suspected he carried them forward instead of leaving them behind. I just never had proof, and honestly, I was scared to look too closely. Would you be willing to give a statement? I'll do better than that, Susan said. I have boxes of old family records in my attic. Our father kept meticulous journals too, Detective. Some habits, I suppose, run in families in ways nobody ever wants to admit. By the time Marsh hung up the phone, he had a clearer picture forming of Harold Kane than any single piece of evidence had provided so far. Not an excuse, never an excuse, but a chain of harm passed down through generations. A wound that had never been treated, finally metastasizing into something that had cost at least one child her life and traumatized dozens more across 2 decades. 3 days later, Ethan Brooks walked out of St. Gabriel Medical Center for the first time, blinking against the bright Montana sunlight, his small hand tucked securely in Caleb's larger one. The parking lot, which had thinned considerably over the preceding days as the acute crisis passed, still held a core of about 40 riders who had come specifically to witness this moment, the culmination of everything that had started with 4 desperate words sent in the dark. Ethan stopped walking the moment he saw them, overwhelmed, and for a moment, Caleb worried the crowd might be too much too soon. But Ethan surprised him. He let go of Caleb's hand and walked slowly at first, then faster toward Wanda, who crouched down immediately at his approach. Thank you, Ethan said so simply, so completely, that several hardened riders standing nearby had to look away, clearing their throats against sudden emotion they weren't prepared to feel in a hospital parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon. You don't have to thank us, kiddo, Wanda said, voice rough. Yes, I do, Ethan said with the particular seriousness of a child who has decided something matters deeply. Caleb said you all came because somebody needed to stand between me and something bad. Nobody's ever done that for me before. So thank you. Wanda pulled him into a brief, careful hug, and over his small shoulder, her eyes met Caleb's. Both of them thinking the same unspoken thing, that whatever else came from this, whatever legal battles still lay ahead, whatever healing this child still needed to do, this moment right here was proof that something had fundamentally shifted. Not just for Ethan, but for every single person who had answered Caleb's call in the dead of night. The drive to Caleb's property took 20 minutes. Ethan pressed against the passenger window of Caleb's truck the entire way, watching the Montana landscape roll past with the wide-eyed attention of a child seeing the world for the first time through eyes no longer clouded entirely by fear. Is it a big house? Ethan asked. Not particularly, Caleb admitted. It's small, but it's got a good yard, and Sal and some of the others fixed up a room for you this week. I hope you like it. They fixed up a room for me. For you, Caleb confirmed. Wanted you to have some place that felt like yours from the very first night. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan's mouth fell open slightly at the sight. Not because the house itself was impressive, a modest, single-story structure with a detached garage, but because gathered in the yard waiting stood nearly a dozen riders and their families, having organized a small, quiet welcome that Caleb hadn't known about until this exact moment. There was a banner hand-painted reading simply, "Welcome home, Ethan." There was a table with the food. There was a dog, Sal's golden retriever tail wagging furiously, straining against her leash to greet the newest arrival. And Ethan, faced with all of this unexpected, overwhelming kindness, froze for a long moment in the truck, uncertain how to process something so far outside his previous experience of what homecoming was supposed to feel like. You okay, buddy? Caleb asked gently. Ethan nodded slowly, though tears had gathered in his eyes. Nobody's ever thrown me a party before. Well, Caleb said, throat tight, get used to it. The following weeks brought their own difficulties, ones that no amount of community goodwill could fully smooth over. Ethan's nightmares came frequently, violent and disorienting, and more than once Caleb found himself sitting on the floor outside the boy's bedroom at 3 a.m, talking him down from panic through the door, learning in real time the particular patient's trauma recovery required. Weekly therapy sessions with a specialist in childhood trauma became a fixed point in their new routine, And Emily, who had become a near-permanent fixture in their lives, often accompanied them both out of genuine care for Ethan and out of the growing unspoken understanding that had developed between her and Caleb over the intensity of those first chaotic days. "He asked me today why Harold hated him," Caleb told her one evening, sitting on his porch after Ethan had finally fallen asleep. "I didn't know what to say." "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't about him at all. That some people carry so much pain themselves they end up putting it on to anyone smaller than them." "I don't know if that's the right thing to tell an 8-year-old. "It's honest," Emily said. "That's probably the best you can do right now." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the distant ridgeline. "I keep thinking about Danny, wondering if things would have been different if I'd fought harder back then. If I'd known then what I know now." "You can't carry that," Emily said gently. "You did everything you could with what you had at the time, and look what you did with what you have now." Caleb didn't answer, but something in his posture eased slightly. The old grief shifting, not gone, never fully gone, but finding a new shape to live inside now that it had somewhere useful to go. Meanwhile, the legal case against Harold Cain continued expanding at a pace that stunned even Detective Marsh's most seasoned colleagues. Susan Cain's records, once fully cataloged, revealed a disturbing generational pattern that prosecutors would later use to argue for the maximum possible sentencing, framing Cain not as an isolated aberration, but as the continuation of a cycle he had chosen repeatedly, deliberately not to break. Diane Forsyth, facing her own charges of dereliction of duty and evidence tampering, ultimately agreed to a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation, providing prosecutors with detailed documentation of exactly how she had buried each complaint testimony that closed several gaps in the timeline and strengthened the case against Cain considerably. The reopened investigation into Danielle Ruiz's death moved forward as a formal homicide case, forensic evidence building steadily toward a picture too clear for even Cain's expensive legal team to obscure. 2 additional former foster children came forward in the weeks following the initial story, adding their voices to Grace Holloway's and the others, each fresh testimony, another nail in the case prosecutors were building. By late spring, the county district attorney's office announced it would be pursuing the maximum available charges: multiple counts of felony child abuse evidence, tampering fraud related to falsified placement records, and second-degree murder in connection with Danielle Ruiz's death. Cain's trial date was set for the following autumn. Amid the ongoing legal proceedings, something quieter and more significant had begun taking root at St. Gabriel Medical Center itself. Dr. Whitfield, still shaken by how close the hospital had come to discharging Ethan directly back into danger, began pushing internally for reform, eventually convincing hospital leadership to implement a new emergency safeguarding protocol specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of institutional hesitation that had nearly cost Ethan his life. "We can't rely on a nurse making a desperate phone call to a motorcycle club every time the system fails a child," Whitfield told the hospital board in a presentation that spring, Emily, seated beside him, having been asked to help design the new protocol based on her firsthand experience. "We need clear, immediate escalation procedures that don't depend on individual heroics." The board, chastened by weeks of national scrutiny and no small amount of pressure from an increasingly engaged public following Ethan's story, approved the new protocol unanimously. Within months, similar policies began spreading to hospitals across the state as administrators who had watched the story unfold nationally reconsidered their own emergency procedures for suspected child abuse cases. State lawmakers took notice too. A bill introduced that legislative session, quickly nicknamed Ethan's Law by the press, though Caleb and Emily both privately worked to keep Ethan's actual name out of most public discourse to protect his privacy, proposed mandatory independent review for any case involving suspected abuse by foster guardians who held positions of significant community influence or institutional donorship, specifically designed to close the exact loophole that had allowed Cain to operate unchecked for over 2 decades. The bill passed with rare bipartisan support that summer. On a warm evening in early June, nearly 4 months after the night that had changed everything, Caleb sat on his porch watching Ethan play fetch with Sal's golden retriever in the yard. The boy's laughter, real unguarded laughter, something that had taken months of patient, careful healing to fully emerge, carrying across the evening air. Emily arrived partway through, having become such a regular presence in their lives that Ethan had started referring to her without any prompting from the adults, as though her role in his life needed no further explanation. He had a good day at therapy, Caleb told her, as she settled into the chair beside him. Dr. Reyes says he's making real progress. Fewer nightmares. He asked to invite a kid from school over for the first time last week. That's huge, Emily said, watching Ethan tackle the dog gently into the grass, both of them tumbling in a heap of joyful chaos. Do you remember how he was that first night? He wouldn't even let me touch his hand without flinching. I remember, Caleb said quietly. I think about it a lot, actually. How close we came to losing this. If you hadn't made that call, if you hadn't answered it, Emily said, none of the rest of it happens. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Ethan's laughter fill the yard, and Caleb found himself thinking not for the first time about how strange it was that the worst night of a child's life had somehow also become the beginning of something entirely new. For all three of them, a family none of them had expected, built from grief and courage, and 4 words typed in desperation at 2:43 in the morning. Caleb, Emily said eventually, something careful in her tone. Marsh called me today. Trial date's confirmed. Kane's lawyers tried for another delay, but the judge denied it. Opening arguments start in September. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Ethan will have to testify. Dr. Reyes thinks he's ready or will be by then. He's stronger than any of us anticipated, Caleb. And he wants to. He told me last week he wants Harold to hear him say out loud that what happened wasn't his fault. Caleb watched Ethan chase the dog across the yard one more time. This small boy who had somehow, against every probability, found his way not just to safety, but to something that increasingly resembled genuine happiness. Then we'll be ready with him, Caleb said, whatever it takes. Ethan looked up just then, catching sight of them, watching from the porch, and waved with the entire unguarded enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who had, for the first time and longer than anyone could measure, absolutely nothing to fear in that moment. Caleb raised his hand and waved back, and beside him, Emily did the same. Both of them watching this boy who had once been too terrified to speak above a whisper, now running freely across an ordinary green lawn on an ordinary summer evening, utterly, completely safe. The porch light flickered on as dusk settled over the property, and somewhere down the road, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a motorcycle engine approached Wanda, arriving for the dinner she'd insisted on cooking that night, another thread in the growing web of chosen family that had assembled itself around this one small boy in the space of a single desperate morning. Caleb watched her pull into the driveway, watched Ethan abandon the dog entirely to run toward her with the easy joy of a child greeting someone he trusted completely, and felt for the first time in 11 long years something that finally unmistakably resembled peace. September arrived faster than any of them felt ready for, and the morning of opening arguments found Caleb standing in his kitchen at 5 a.m., staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, listening to the sound of Ethan moving around upstairs, unable to sleep any more than Caleb himself had. You don't have to be strong today, Caleb told him when the boy finally came downstairs still in pajamas, eyes shadowed with the particular exhaustion of a 9-year-old carrying something far too heavy for his age. Whatever you feel today, that's allowed. I'm not scared, Ethan said, though his hands were trembling slightly around the glass of orange juice Caleb had poured him. I keep thinking about what happens if the jury doesn't believe me. Caleb crouched down to his level, the same instinct that had guided him through that first terrified night in the hospital room, still as sharp as ever. Buddy, you've got Emily's documentation. You've got Grace's testimony, and Susan's records, and Danielle's case, and a coroner's report that doesn't lie. You are not walking into that courtroom alone. You never have been, not since that first morning. Ethan nodded slowly, though the anxiety didn't fully leave his face, and Caleb understood that no reassurance, however true, could fully erase what this day would cost the boy to get through. The courthouse steps of that morning held a sight that made even seasoned reporters pause mid-sentence. Nearly 300 riders, more than had gathered even on that first extraordinary night, standing in silent formation along the perimeter. Not blocking entry, not raising voices, simply present the same disciplined wall of quiet solidarity that had first drawn national attention 7 months earlier. Carla Diaz, now covering the trial for a statewide outlet after her original reporting had launched her into a level of recognition she'd never anticipated, stood near the courthouse doors doing a live segment as the crowd assembled. What we're witnessing here today, she said into her microphone, is the culmination of a story that captured this country's attention back in February the night a hospital nurse's desperate phone call brought over 300 motorcycle riders to stand vigil for an abused child. Today, that child now safely in emergency foster care with the very rider who answered that call will testify against his former guardian, Harold Cain, in what prosecutors are calling one of the most significant child welfare cases in state history. Inside the courtroom filled to capacity, extra seating brought in for the overflow of press and public interest, and Cain sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had 7 months earlier. His expensive suit somehow failing to carry the same authority it once had his lawyer beside him, wearing the particular tightness of a man who had run out of angles to work. Grace Holloway testified first, her voice steady, despite the visible effort it cost her, walking the jury through 3 years of documented abuse that had shaped the entire trajectory of her adult life. Susan Cain followed her testimony about her father's cycle of violence, and Harold's own childhood, providing crucial context that the prosecution used carefully, not as excuse but as pattern, establishing exactly how deliberately Cain had continued a legacy he'd had every opportunity to break instead. The forensic pathologist testified next, walking the jury through the multiple healing fractures found in Danielle Ruiz's re-examined remains, each slide projected onto the courtroom screen, landing like a small earthquake through the gathered spectators, several jurors visibly shaken by the clinical undeniable evidence of sustained abuse leading to a child's death. Then on the third day of testimony, it was Ethan's turn. The judge had arranged for him to testify via closed-circuit video from an adjoining room, a small mercy extended to spare him the trauma of Cain's direct physical presence, and Emily sat beside him throughout, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder as the prosecutor gently walked him through his experience. "Ethan," the prosecutor said softly, "can you tell us what happened when you didn't do exactly what Harold wanted?" Ethan's small voice carried into the courtroom through the video feed was quiet but did not waver. "He'd put me in the closet, sometimes for a whole day. Sometimes he'd tie my hands so I couldn't bang on the door." "Were you ever hurt physically beyond being restrained?" Ethan nodded, then remembered he needed to speak aloud for the record. "Yes, he'd hit me. Sometimes with his hand, sometimes with a belt. He always said it was because I made him do it, because I was bad." "Do you believe that now, that you were bad and that's why this happened?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and in the courtroom, jurors leaned forward, almost imperceptibly waiting. "No," Ethan finally said, his voice gaining a strength that surprised even Emily, who had watched him grow so much over the preceding months but hadn't quite anticipated this particular moment of clarity. "Caleb told me it was never about me, that some people just want to hurt kids smaller than them, and it doesn't matter how good you are, they'll find a reason anyway." I believe him. Harold hurt me because he wanted to, not because I deserved it. In the courtroom, Cain's face had gone rigid, his composed mask finally cracking under the weight of a 9-year-old's simple, devastating clarity, and even his own lawyer seemed to understand, watching several jurors wipe their eyes, that this moment had likely sealed the outcome of the entire case. The defense's case, when it finally came, proved thin and desperate character witnesses testifying to Cain's community contributions, an expert witness attempting to challenge the forensic timeline on Danielle Ruiz's injuries, none of it managing to overcome the accumulated weight of testimony from Grace, from Ethan, from the other former foster children who had come forward, from the physical evidence recovered at Cain's property. Closing arguments stretched into a fourth day, and when the jury finally retired to deliberate, the courthouse steps once again filled with the same silent, patient wall of riders who had first gathered 7 months earlier, now joined by hundreds of ordinary citizens who had followed the case some driving hours to be present for the verdict. The deliberation took 11 hours. When the jury foreman finally stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that Caleb, sitting beside Emily with Ethan tucked protectively between them, could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "On the count of second-degree murder in the death of Danielle Ruiz," the foreman read, "we find the defendant Harold Cain guilty." A collective sound moved through the courtroom, something between a gasp and a sob, and the foreman continued through count after count: felony child abuse, multiple counts. Guilty on every single one. Fraud related to falsified placement records. Guilty. Evidence tampering related to the original investigation. Guilty. Cain sat motionless at the defense table as the verdicts landed one after another, his face drained of all color, and when the judge finally addressed sentencing weeks later, the maximum available penalty came down with a weight that felt to everyone who had followed this case from that first desperate night like something approaching justice, even if nothing could ever fully repair what had been broken. Life in prison without possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, as the news reached the waiting crowd, an eruption of sound broke the months of tension, not celebration exactly, but released the particular collective exhale of people who had stood together through something enormous and finally watched it reach its conclusion. Ethan, standing on the courthouse steps between Caleb and Emily, looked up at both of them with an expression that seemed, for the first time since that terrifying night 8 months earlier, entirely unburdened. "Is it really over?" he asked. "The trial part is," Caleb said, kneeling down to meet his eyes. "The healing part that's still ongoing, and that's okay. But yeah, buddy, he's never getting out. He can never hurt you or anyone else again." Ethan threw his arms around Caleb's neck, and over his shoulder, Caleb caught Emily's eyes, both of them sharing a look that carried 8 months of shared fear, shared hope, and shared determination, finally fully realized. In the months following the verdict, the story's impact continued rippling outward in ways none of them could have fully anticipated that first chaotic night. Ethan's law, having passed the previous summer, began showing measurable results within its first year of implementation, with 3 additional cases of institutional abuse cover-up uncovered across the state after the new independent review requirements exposed patterns that previous oversight structures had allowed to remain hidden. Diane Forsyth, sentenced to 18 months for evidence tampering and dereliction of duty, used part of her plea agreement to help train a new generation of caseworkers on recognizing exactly the kind of institutional pressure that had led her down the path she'd taken, an uncomfortable but ultimately valuable contribution to preventing future failures of the same kind. St. Gabriel Medical Center's new emergency safeguarding protocol, developed jointly by Dr. Whitfield and Emily, was formally adopted by 6 additional hospitals across the state. Within the first year, each implementation citing Ethan's case as the catalyst that had exposed exactly how dangerous institutional hesitation could be when a child's safety hung in the balance. Grace Holloway, having found unexpected purpose in the aftermath of her testimony, left her career in accounting to become a full-time advocate for survivors of foster care abuse, founding a small nonprofit specifically focused on helping adult survivors process childhood trauma that had gone unaddressed for decades. Work she described in an interview that spring as finally giving meaning to pain she'd carried silently for over 20 years. "I spent 2 decades thinking nobody would ever believe me," she told a reporter. "Then I watched a hospital parking lot fill with 300 strangers who believed a scared little boy without a single moment of hesitation. That changed something in me I didn't know could still change." Well, Caleb's official foster certification, initially provisional, became permanent that winter, following months of home visits, therapy check-ins, and evaluations that Renata Alvarez personally oversaw with a thoroughness that reflected both procedural necessity and her own genuine investment in seeing this particular placement succeed. "I've been doing this job 17 years, Renata told Caleb during their final formal review. "I've seen a lot of placements, and I don't think I've ever seen a kid transform the way Ethan has since that first week. Whatever you're doing, Mr. Mercer, keep doing it." "I'm just showing up," Caleb said simply. "Every single day, that's really all it is. That's more than most kids in this system ever get," Renata said. "Don't undersell it." The formal adoption proceedings began that spring, a process that moved with far less drama than everything that had preceded it, but carried an emotional weight that for Caleb dwarfed even the chaos of that first extraordinary night. He remembered sitting in his garage 8 months earlier, typing 4 desperate words into a chat he hadn't touched in over a decade, having no idea that those words would eventually lead him here, to a courtroom far quieter than the one where Cain had been sentenced, standing before a family court judge with Ethan's small hand gripped tightly in his own. "Do you, Caleb Mercer, understand the full weight and permanence of the responsibility you are undertaking today?" The judge asked, a formality required by law, but one that Caleb answered with more genuine emotion than any oath he had ever taken. "I do," he said, voice thick. "I understood it the night I got the call. I just didn't have the paperwork to prove it yet." The judge, an older woman who had presided over countless adoption proceedings, but who had, like most of the state, followed this particular case with more personal investment than she usually allowed herself, smiled warmly. Then by the authority vested in me by the state of Montana, she said, I hereby finalize this adoption. Ethan Brooks, you are now legally and permanently the son of Caleb Mercer. The small courtroom filled not with the overwhelming crowd of that first night, but with the core group who had carried this journey from its very beginning. Emily, Wanda, Big Sal, Grace Holloway, who had specifically requested to attend, and Renata herself erupted into the kind of joyful, unrestrained celebration that courtrooms rarely witness, and Ethan, finally completely secure in a way he had once believed impossible, buried his face against Caleb's chest and cried tears that carried nothing but relief. I'm convinced. That evening, back at the house that had over the preceding months filled increasingly with the warmth and chaos of an actual family, rather than a bachelor's quiet solitude, Caleb stood in his kitchen, watching Emily help Ethan with a science project spread across the table. The two of them bent together over a half-built volcano model, laughing about something Caleb couldn't quite hear from where he stood. He'd asked Emily to move in 3 months earlier, a conversation that had felt, after everything they'd built together into that first desperate phone call, less like a beginning and more like a simple acknowledgement of something that had already become true. She'd said yes without hesitation, and watching her now flour-dusted from an earlier baking attempt, laughing at whatever chaos Ethan had introduced into their volcano's construction. Caleb felt something settle fully into place that he'd assumed for 11 long years was permanently broken beyond repair. You're staring, Emily said, glancing up and catching him watching from the doorway. Just thinking, Caleb said, about how different this kitchen looked 8 months ago. Better now. Better than I ever thought it could be. Ethan looked up from the volcano, catching the tail end of the exchange with the particular perceptiveness children develop when surrounded by adults who love them openly. Are you two going to get married? Emily nearly choked on the water she'd been sipping, and Caleb felt heat rise up his neck in a way that hadn't happened to him in longer than he could remember. That's a conversation for another day, buddy, Caleb managed. I think you should, Ethan said matter-of-factly, returning his attention to the volcano with the total confidence of a child who had decided something and considered the matter settled. You already act married anyway. Emily's laughter filled the kitchen, bright and unguarded, and Caleb found himself laughing too. Something he'd done so rarely in the decade before. That phone call rang through his garage at 2:43 in the morning. A year to the day after that first phone call, the community that had formed around Ethan's rescue gathered once more, not in crisis this time, but in celebration, a barbecue at Caleb's property that had grown through word of mouth and shared history into something resembling a small reunion. Riders who had answered that original call arrived throughout the afternoon along with Grace Holloway, who had become something like an honorary aunt to Ethan over the preceding months. And even Detective Marsh, who had maintained contact with the family throughout the ongoing aftermath of the case and had grown somewhat to his own surprise genuinely fond of the boy, whose testimony had helped close one of the most significant cases of his career. Ethan, now approaching his 10th birthday, moved through the gathering with an ease and confidence that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had witnessed that first terrified, hollow-eyed child curled defensively on a hospital bed exactly 1 year earlier. He laughed freely. He argued good-naturedly with Sal about whose turn it was to grill. He fell asleep that evening on the porch swing between Caleb and Emily, utterly at peace, utterly safe, utterly loved. As the party wound down and most of the guests had departed, Wanda lingered on the porch with Caleb, watching the last light fade over the property. You did good, you know, she said quietly. Better than good. I didn't do it alone, Caleb said. None of this happens without you, without Sal, without everyone who showed up that night without asking a single question. That's what family does, Wanda said simply. You taught us that a long time ago before you ever left the club. Some of us just needed a reminder. Caleb looked down at Ethan sleeping peacefully between him and Emily and thought about Danny for a moment, not with the sharp, unbearable grief that had defined so much of the last decade, but with something gentler. Now, a quiet gratitude that Danny's memory had in some strange and unexpected way helped save another child's life. I used to think brotherhood was about patches, Caleb said quietly. About the vest, the rides, the club. Took me 11 years and one phone call to understand it was never about any of that. It's about showing up. That's the whole thing. Just showing up when somebody needs you and not asking why and not counting the cost. Wanda nodded slowly, watching the stars begin to emerge over the ridgeline. 4 words, she said. That's all it took. Need brothers. Hospital. Now. 4 words, Caleb agreed, and about 300 people who understood exactly what they meant without needing a single one explained. Duh. Ethan stirred slightly against Caleb's shoulder, not quite waking, murmuring something too soft to catch before settling back into peaceful sleep. And Caleb adjusted his arm carefully around the boy, mindful even now, a year later, of protecting him from anything that might disturb the rare, hard-won peace he had finally found. Emily reached over and took Caleb's free hand, lacing her fingers through his, and the 3 of them sat together on that porch as the Montana night deepened around them, a family built not from blood, but from courage, from a nurse who refused to look away from a broken man who answered a call at 2:43 in the morning without a single moment of hesitation, and from 300 strangers who understood in their bones that some calls simply cannot go unanswered. Somewhere down the road, faint in the growing darkness, the sound of a single motorcycle passed by, engine steady and unhurried, and Caleb found himself smiling at the familiar sound, no longer a summons to danger or desperation, but simply the quiet, comforting rhythm of the world he had rebuilt from the wreckage of his own grief, a world where a frightened boy could finally sleep without fear, where love had proven louder than cruelty, and where an entire brotherhood had taught an entire nation that true strength was never measured by the fear a man could inspire, but by the courage he showed when he chose without hesitation to stand between a helpless child and the darkness that once threatened to consume him completely. And on that porch beneath a sky full of steady Montana stars surrounded by the family he had never expected but would never again take for granted, Caleb Mercer finally understood with absolute and unshakable certainty that some promises once made are never ever broken.